The letters were in her hands before she had time to decide whether she was ready to read them. She had not been searching for anything that afternoon. She had not been watching Aldrich more carefully than usual, had not been suspicious of anything in particular, had not spent the morning with a sense of foreboding or dread. She had simply been walking through the entrance hall of Thornhaven Estate, when the draft from the closing front door had shifted his traveling cloak on its hook, and a small bundle had slid from the inside pocket and landed on the stone floor, with a sound so quiet that almost anyone else in almost any other moment would have stepped over it without looking twice. Alara heard it perfectly. She stood over it for several seconds before she bent to pick it up. In those seconds, which felt longer than they were, she had a distinct and strange awareness that what she did next would matter in ways she could not yet fully name. The bundle was small, tied with a pale green ribbon, sealed with red wax and a pressed flower. It looked private, in the specific way that things kept hidden always do, the kind of object that carries its own atmosphere, that seems to know it belongs in a pocket rather than on open ground. She picked it up. There were 12 letters in total. She had thought there were 10 when she first gathered them, because 2 had been folded together, and she did not separate them until she was nearly at the end. She carried them to her writing room, closed the door behind her, sat at her desk, and read every single one, from the first word of the first to the last word of the last. She did not rush. She did not skip sentences. She went back over certain lines when she needed to make sure she had understood correctly, and she always had. The letters were from Countess Isadora Lenz. Alara knew the name, though barely. Isadora Lenz had been mentioned at their dinner table 2 weeks ago, briefly, in the unremarkable way of someone Aldrich had crossed paths with at Lord Geoffrey Vane's estate gathering. He had said the name with the casual ease of a man referencing something entirely inconsequential. Alara had felt, in the moment he said it, something she could only describe now as a small interior tug, the barely there sensation of a detail that does not quite settle smoothly. She had dismissed it as nothing. She had been in the habit, she understood now, of dismissing such tugs. She had felt many of them over the course of 3 years, a name said too lightly, an afternoon unaccounted for, a quality of attention in him that seemed, sometimes, directed elsewhere even when he was looking right at her. Small things, the kind of things that a person who wants to believe the best will always find a way to explain, in the most charitable available direction. She had been very good at charitable explanations. The letters made charity impossible. They were not vague. They were not the carefully coded communications of 2 people uncertain of each other. They were warm and specific and full of a shared language, private jokes, recurring names, references to places and evenings that made up a life being lived alongside hers. They were the letters of a woman who was entirely comfortable in the place she occupied, who knew where she stood, who had never once, from the evidence of her writing, been uncertain of her welcome. The dates on the letters stretched from 18 months into Alara's marriage, all the way to 6 weeks before the present day. 6 weeks. The ink on the most recent letter had barely had time to settle into the page. The oldest letter was dated in the 2nd autumn of her marriage, a season she remembered with genuine warmth, because Aldrich had seemed particularly attentive that year, particularly present. She had thought it was because they were finding their rhythm as a couple. She understood now what it had actually been. She found, in the 6th letter, a reference she recognized. Isadora wrote about a visit to a lakeside property, a specific lake, a specific afternoon, a detail about the light on the water that matched a description Alara herself had once written in a letter to her father, because she had been standing at the same window with Aldrich on their first summer together, and had found it so beautiful she wanted to share it. She had thought it was their moment. She had put it in a letter home. She had not known she was sharing it with someone else. She reached the end of the last letter and set it down. Her hands were steady. She looked at them. She had expected, in some abstract and unexamined corner of herself, that if she ever received information of this nature, she would feel her hands tremble. She would feel the room move. She would feel something break open in her chest, in a way that could not be contained. She had read enough stories, heard enough accounts from other women at court who had passed through similar moments, to expect a certain quality of devastation. The devastation did not arrive in the form she had imagined. What she felt was harder to name, and in some ways more complete than simple pain. It was clarity. Not the kind of clarity that comes from understanding something new, but the kind that comes from finally seeing something that has been present all along, just slightly out of focus, like adjusting the lens on a telescope and watching a blurred shape resolve into precise, sharp lines. The shape had always been there. She was only now seeing it accurately. She thought about the evening 2 years ago, when she had told Aldrich, with more vulnerability than she usually allowed herself, that she sometimes felt a distance in their marriage that she could not explain. She had chosen her words carefully that night, had tried to express something real without making it sound like an accusation, had offered it as something they could address together. He had taken her hands. He had looked at her with a sincerity she had found entirely convincing. He had said she was imagining it. He had said that the first years of a marriage always had a settling period, and that everything between them was fine, and that she ought not to read difficulty into what was simply the normal rhythm of a shared life. She had believed him. She had been enormously relieved to believe him. She thought about that relief now. She recognized it for what it had been, not the relief of hearing the truth, but the relief of having the door closed on something she was not ready to face. Aldrich had known exactly how to close that door. He had done it with the particular gentle confidence of a man who had long practice at managing the perceptions of the people around him. She thought about him without bitterness, which surprised her. She tried to find the anger she felt she ought to be feeling, and she found instead something quieter and more complete. A kind of tiredness, not the exhaustion of the overwhelmed, but the deeper tiredness of a person who has been working harder than they knew at something that was not what it appeared to be. She had been working at her marriage for 3 years, with the full effort of a person who believed in what they were doing. She had brought everything she had, her attention, her warmth, her capacity for love, her patience, her intelligence. She had brought all of it. She had simply been bringing it to something that was not entirely there. This was not her failure. She said this to herself carefully and clearly. It was not a failure of love or warmth or intelligence or worth. It was the consequence of a decision he had made, repeatedly, over a long period, with full knowledge of what it cost her. The responsibility for it was entirely his, and she was not going to spend a single moment redistributing any portion of it in her own direction. She thought about Isadora Lenz, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she felt nothing harsh toward her. Isadora had not stood before a priest and made a promise. Aldrich had. The line of accountability was clear, and Alara intended to keep it clear. She thought about her father. He was a straightforward man, her father. He had run his modest estate with careful hands, and had loved her mother plainly and completely, without drama, for 32 years. He had not been a man of great words, but he had been a man of exact words, and the evening before the marriage settlement was signed, he had sat her down at the kitchen table, with the documents spread before him, and walked her through every clause with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details matter more when everything is going well than when things begin to go wrong. She had been too happy that evening to give the details the attention they deserved. She had been 22, and in love, and enormously impatient to be done with the paperwork, and get on with the life that was about to begin. But her father had been patient. He had made her listen. He had made her understand that her mother's inheritance, a townhouse in the capital's North Quarter, a protected account, a modest portfolio of investments, remained entirely her own under the settlement, not subject to the management of her husband, not subject to his debts or his decisions. Entirely, legally, completely hers. Whatever happens, he had said, and she had heard the weight of the phrase, but not fully the meaning. You will not be without a floor to stand on. She had kissed him on the cheek, and gone to pack for the morning. She had thought him overly cautious. She had thought he was being the father of a bride, rather than a man with clear eyes and a long view. Sitting now at her desk with the letters before her, she sent him silent and sincere gratitude across the distance between them. She needed to see the documents. She needed to understand the full legal shape of her situation, what was precisely hers, what the settlement allowed, what the process of a formal separation would require and permit. She needed this information, not in the general way she had absorbed it at her father's kitchen table, but in the exact, specific, documented way that would allow her to make decisions with clear eyes. She would write to Mr. Cornelius Aldgate, the family solicitor who had managed her mother's estate since Alara was 14, and had been present at the settlement discussions. A meeting could be arranged without raising any question. She had ordinary, practical reasons to want to review her inherited assets. Nothing in such a request would signal anything to anyone. The meeting with the solicitor would happen first. Everything else would follow. She had decided something else too, and this decision came with the quiet certainty of something already known, rather than the struggle of something being worked out. She would not confront Aldrich, not yet, not until she was standing on ground that was entirely her own. The temptation was real. She felt it sitting in her chest like pressure. The pull to walk downstairs when he came home, and lay everything on the table between them, and demand that he account for what she had read. She wanted him to see that she knew. She wanted to stop carrying the weight of the knowledge alone. She wanted, in some part of herself she was honest enough to acknowledge, the particular painful relief of a confrontation. But she thought about it clearly, and she saw its problem. He was practiced at managing difficult moments. She had seen it many times. The way he could take an uncomfortable situation and soften it, reframe it, redirect it, with the ease of a man who had never had to face consequences he had not already managed in advance. If she confronted him tonight, he would apologize. He would be convincing. He would be remorseful, in exactly the right degree, and charming, in exactly the right way. And she was not entirely sure. She was honest enough to admit this too, that she was beyond the reach of that charm. She could not put herself in that position. Not yet. Not until she had something to stand on that did not depend on his goodwill or his guilt. She tied the ribbon back around the letters with care. She checked that the bow sat in the same position it had been in before. She walked back to the entrance hall and slid the bundle into the inside pocket of the cloak and smoothed the fabric with one hand. Then she went to the kitchen and asked for her afternoon tea. Clara brought it quietly and poured the cup and asked if she needed anything else. Alara told her no, and to please make sure she had an undisturbed hour. Clara left without a word. Alara sat by the sitting room window and drank her tea and looked at the garden, where the late afternoon light was doing what autumn light always did, turning everything a color that was too beautiful to last. She thought about her life without sharpness, not about what she was losing or what had been taken, but about what she was beginning to understand she had never fully had. The marriage had contained real things, real seasons, real dinners, real mornings in shared rooms. But it had not been what she had believed it to be, and the difference between the real and the believed was something she was going to have to sit with for a while. She gave herself permission to feel the sadness of that gap without making it larger than it was. She was not destroyed. She was not ended. She was, in fact, sitting in a chair and drinking tea and thinking clearly, which was not the behavior of a woman who had been broken by what she had found. She had been, she realized, always somewhat more capable of difficulty than she had known. When Aldrich came home at 6, she was reading in the sitting room. She looked up when he entered, greeted him warmly, and listened to his account of his afternoon with the same interested attention she had always offered him. He talked about the club, a conversation with Lord Geoffrey Vane, the weather turning. He stretched his legs toward the fire and reached for his newspaper and looked entirely comfortable in his own home. She watched him from behind her book. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are seeing, for the first time, in its actual proportions. Not the version she had wanted, not the version she had built in the space between what he showed her and what she needed to believe. Just the actual man, sitting in an armchair, thoroughly at ease. She thought, "You do not know what this afternoon has been. You do not know that everything is different now. You are sitting there with your newspaper and your comfortable fire and your complete confidence that I am exactly where you left me, and you have no idea." She found this not satisfying but simply true. She filed it away. She turned a page. They sat together until dinner, and after dinner, she pleaded a headache and went to bed early. She lay in the quiet of her room and stared at the ceiling and made, in her careful and methodical way, a list. Not of grievances. That list would be too long and too heavy to be useful. A practical list. What she needed to do, in what order. What she needed to find out, to secure, to understand, to arrange. She went through it slowly, making sure nothing was missing, checking each item against the next. She fell asleep before 11. She slept, to her own mild astonishment, deeply. She woke in the morning with the list still in her head, undiminished, and she rose and dressed and went downstairs and began. The appointment with Mr. Cornelius Aldgate was arranged within 4 days. Alara had written a brief, practical letter requesting a review of her mother's estate documentation. She had given the letter to a footman to post on Monday morning, and the reply had arrived by Wednesday, with a proposed meeting time at the solicitor's offices in the professional quarter of the capital. She had written back to confirm. She had told Aldrich, over breakfast on Thursday, that she had an appointment with the family solicitor in the city the following week regarding her mother's holdings. She had said it in the same unhurried tone in which she might have mentioned that she needed to visit the dressmaker, or that the garden wall needed attention. Aldrich had nodded and returned to his newspaper. She had felt nothing at his lack of interest, which was, she supposed, its own kind of information. She drove to the city on a gray Tuesday morning, with Clara beside her in the carriage. Clara had said very little since the previous week. She was the kind of woman who understood, with an instinct that went beyond training, when silence was more useful than speech. She had watched Alara with careful, quiet eyes, and had done her work with even more precision than usual, and she had asked no questions. Alara was deeply grateful for her. Mr. Aldgate received her in his paneled office, which smelled of old books and leather, and the particular dry calm of a room in which large decisions had been made by composed people for a very long time. He was a compact, white-haired man of 60, who had known her since she was a child, and who had the precise and courteous manner of someone who had learned, over decades of practice, that the most important thing a good solicitor could do was listen before he spoke. He offered tea. She accepted. He settled the cups between them, and asked how he could be of service. She told him she needed to understand, in full and precise detail, everything that was hers. He looked at her for a moment, with the measured consideration of a man who had heard a great many things across the desk of his office, and had learned to hear not just the words, but what sat beneath them. He nodded once, without comment, and reached for the relevant files. He spent the next 2 hours going through everything. The townhouse in the northern quarter of the capital, in her name, free and clear, income generating from a long-term commercial tenant on the ground floor. The protected account, her mother's savings, untouched and accrued with modest interest across the years since her mother's passing. The investment portfolio, small but stable, generating a quarterly income that was, while not lavish, entirely sufficient for a woman of modest and well-managed requirements. The prenuptial settlement, her father had indeed secured every clause he had described at the kitchen table, and one he had not mentioned, which provided for the return of a portion of her dowry under specific circumstances that Mr. Aldgate explained in careful, neutral language. She listened to all of it. She asked 5 precise questions. He answered each one with equal precision. By the time they finished, she understood exactly where she stood. She stood on ground that was solid, legally protected, and entirely her own. Not lavish ground. She would not have the household staff, and the country estate, and the social position that came with being the wife of Duke Aldrich Voss. But she would have a roof, and an income, and the legal dignity of a woman who had never needed anyone's charity. Her father had given her this. He had given it to her on an evening when she had been too impatient to appreciate it, and it was the most useful gift she had ever received. She thanked Mr. Aldgate. He walked her to the door with the unhurried courtesy of an older generation. As she stepped through, he said quietly, without drama, that if she needed to take any further steps, she should not hesitate to be in touch. She thanked him again. She went to her carriage. She rode home with the window slightly open, watching the fields pass on either side of the road, and she thought about what she was about to do, not with fear. She had reached some place on the other side of fear in the writing room with the letters, but with the steady, gathering attention of a person preparing to do something that required all of them to do it right. She had decided on a Thursday morning. Not any specific Thursday, she would know it when she saw it. A morning when Aldrich had left for his obligations, when the household had settled into its routine, when nothing would suggest to anyone that anything unusual was happening until she was already gone. She had 4 weeks, possibly 5. She was not going to rush. The quality of the preparation mattered more than the speed. In those 4 weeks, Alara moved through the surface of her life with a composure so complete that it functioned like a disguise. She managed the household accounts. She arranged a dinner party for 12, handled the guest list, managed the menu and the seating, with the efficiency that had made her, over 3 years, one of the more reliably accomplished hostesses in their social circle. She attended 2 court events on Aldrich's arm, and smiled at the right moments, and remembered the right names, and asked the right questions, and not one single person in any of those rooms looked at her and saw anything other than the composed and capable Lady Alara Voss. Aldrich, however, had begun to notice something. He could not have said precisely what it was. He could not have pointed to a single moment or behavior and identified it as the source. It was more atmospheric than that. A quality to the house, a quality to her, something in the specific texture of her attention. She was warm toward him. She was pleasant and capable, and socially exactly as she had always been. But there was something behind it now. A depth that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there, and had not, until now, been so thoroughly her own. He told himself he was imagining it. He had reason to be anxious, and anxious men find problems in places that don't have them. This was what he told himself. He was not a man who examined his own behavior with great frequency or depth. He had never found the practice useful, but he was not entirely without self-awareness, and he knew, in the way that people who have done things they shouldn't always know in some part of themselves, that he had reason to be uneasy. He checked the inside pocket of his cloak twice over the following 2 weeks. The bundle was there. The ribbon was tied correctly. He could not find anything that suggested she had touched them. He convinced himself she hadn't. But the feeling did not go away. It sat in him, like a low noise, barely audible, the kind of sound you stop hearing after a while, and then suddenly hear again, and realize has been there all along. One evening, he came home, to find her in the library, with a book and a cup of tea, and something about the scene, the absolute self-containment of her, the way she looked, settled in a way that did not include him at its center, made him stop in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. She looked up. She smiled. She asked how his afternoon had been. He told her it had been fine. He sat down across from her. He watched her read. She was not performing her reading for him. She was actually reading, engaged with whatever was on the page, occasionally pressing a finger to a line, as if marking something for later. He had sat in this room with her dozens of times and never noticed this habit. He was not sure what it meant that he was noticing it now. He said her name. She looked up. He said he had the feeling lately that she was somewhat elsewhere, that she seemed, and here he searched for a word that would be accurate without being alarming, preoccupied. She considered him for a moment, not unkindly, not with any heat. "I have a great deal to think about," she said. "What sort of things?" he asked. "Household things, financial things, things I want to understand better." She said it plainly, as if it were entirely unremarkable. He said he hoped she would tell him if anything was troubling her. She looked at him for a moment, before she answered. "There is nothing I need your help with at the moment," she said. "But thank you." She returned to her book. He sat in his chair, and could not find a single thing to argue with in what she had said. She had been perfectly pleasant. She had not shut him out, or spoken coldly, or done anything he could point to, and yet he felt, sitting in that room, slightly as if the ground had shifted by a degree too small to see, but significant enough to feel. He went to bed early. He slept badly. He wrote to Isadora that week. Her response took 4 days, which was longer than usual, and when it came, it was shorter than her letters typically were. She was at her country estate, she said, dealing with some property concerns. She would be in the city when the season turned. The letter had the quality of something written from a distance, not in miles but in attention. He read it twice and put it away, and did not examine the feeling it produced in him. Elara, meanwhile, had asked Clara a direct question. She had done it on a Wednesday morning, while Clara was dressing her hair, in the particular privacy of that daily ritual, and she had asked it without preamble, because Clara was the kind of person who was best addressed directly. She asked if Clara would be willing to accompany her if she moved to a different residence. Clara met her eyes in the mirror. She held Elara's gaze for one steady moment. Then she said, "Yes." Without hesitation, without questions, with the quiet definiteness of someone who had already been thinking about what she would say, if asked exactly this thing. Elara thanked her. Clara finished dressing her hair. Neither of them said anything more about it. They did not need to. The following week, Elara packed a small wooden box. It held her mother's letters, a miniature portrait of her parents painted when they were young, a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, 3 books she returned to regularly, and a small journal, in which she had, over the past month, made notes that she did not want to leave behind. The box was compact enough to fit inside a lady's traveling case without drawing attention. She asked Clara to keep it in her own room. Clara took the box and said nothing. The house moved around them as it always had, the kitchen producing meals, the garden being tended, the social invitations being managed, the estate accounts being kept. Aldrich went about his days. He attended his club and his various engagements, and came home, each evening, to a house that was, from every visible angle, entirely unchanged. He was not a man who paid close attention to surfaces, having always assumed that what was beneath them would not differ greatly from what he could see. This habit had served him comfortably for most of his life. In the last week before her planned Thursday, Elara walked the rooms of Thornhaven Estate with the particular attention of someone taking a long and final look. She was not sentimental about it. She did not allow herself to be sentimental about it, but she was honest. There had been real things in this house, real mornings, and real seasons, and the genuine efforts of a woman who had worked to make a marriage out of something that had never been fully offered to her. The house had held those efforts. It was not the house's fault that the person she had shared it with had not been who she believed. She was leaving without anger, without hatred, without the particular burning energy of a woman who needs her departure to say something to the person she is leaving. She had nothing to prove to Aldrich Voss. She had only something to prove to herself, and she had already begun proving it in the weeks of clear-eyed preparation that had brought her to this point. The Thursday she had been waiting for arrived with an ordinary gray sky and the smell of autumn turning toward winter in the air. Aldrich left at 8 for his morning obligations. She watched his carriage move down the long drive from the window of the upper hall, and when it turned the corner and was gone, she went to her room and dressed and told Clara it was time. She took 2 trunks. Everything else she was leaving. She had no interest in fighting over possessions. They were just things, and she had what she needed. Clara had her own bag and the small wooden box. They were at the front door before 9 o'clock. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Fay, was in the kitchen when Elara came downstairs. She looked up when she saw the trunks. She was a sensible woman of 50, who had run the household for 12 years, and who missed very little that happened within its walls. She looked at Elara for a moment, with the expression of a woman who has suspected something for some time, and is now seeing it confirmed. Elara told her calmly that she was going to the capital for an extended stay, and that the household should continue its routines as normal. She would be in contact with relevant staff regarding any outstanding matters. She thanked her for her service over the years, and meant it. Mrs. Fay nodded slowly. "Will you want anything prepared for your arrival in town, my lady?" "The townhouse has been kept in order by the management agent," Elara said. "We will manage." She shook Mrs. Fay's hand. She thanked 2 other members of the household staff by name. Then she walked to the carriage, got in, arranged her coat against the morning cold, and told the driver to go. She did not look back at the house as the carriage moved down the drive. Not out of bitterness. She had already said her private goodbye to it on her evening walks. She simply looked ahead. The drive to the capital took 4 hours. She spent most of it looking out the window at the countryside, which was beautiful in the flat, honest way of late autumn. Clara sat across from her and dozed in the gentle rocking of the carriage. Elara thought about very little, and felt, with increasing clarity as the miles passed, that she was not fleeing from something, but moving toward something. The townhouse was in the northern quarter of the capital, on a quiet street of pale stone buildings with wide windows. She had been here as a child, when her mother was alive, and they came to the city on occasional visits. She had not been back since her mother died. It was smaller than she remembered from childhood, which meant it was a perfectly reasonable size for a woman living alone, with 1 member of staff, and the steady requirements of a quietly independent life. She unlocked the front door herself. The management agent had kept the house clean and well aired. There were fresh linens on the beds. The kitchen was stocked with basics. There was a fire laid in the sitting room grate, ready to be lit. She lit it herself. She stood in the center of the sitting room with her coat still on, listening to the fire catch, and she breathed in the smell of the unfamiliar house that was now, legally and completely, her own. Clara was upstairs with the trunks. The street outside was quiet. A cart passed. A dog barked somewhere down the block and then stopped. Elara took off her coat. She hung it on the hook by the door. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. This was the first afternoon of her actual life, and she intended to begin it with a cup of tea, made in her own kitchen, in her own house, where every room was hers, and the silence in each one was hers, and everything from the floors to the ceiling was, for the first time in 3 years, entirely accountable to no one but herself. She stood at the kitchen window while the kettle heated and watched a pair of pigeons moving on the ledge of the opposite building, and she felt, moving through her like slow water, something she recognized after a moment as a feeling she had not had in a long time. She felt like herself. The court found out on a Friday. Not because Alara told anyone, not because Aldrich said anything, at least not at first. These things travel on their own. A footman mentions something to a cousin, who mentions it to a lady's maid, who mentions it to her employer. A carriage seen leaving an estate early in the morning with luggage aboard. An absence noticed at a social engagement where presence had always been reliable. The machinery of gossip in the capital did not need facts to begin operating. It only needed an anomaly, and the absence of Lady Alara Voss from the estate she had managed impeccably for 3 years was a very clear anomaly indeed. By the following Monday, it had reached the drawing rooms. By Wednesday, it had reached the clubs. By the end of that week, the shape of the story, though not its accurate content, had made the rounds of approximately 40 households, in 40 different versions, each more confident and less accurate than the last. Some said she had gone to care for an ailing relative. Some said there had been a disagreement of an unspecified but dramatic nature. One particularly inventive account had her departing for a cousin's estate in the north, following a society scandal of some kind, the details of which varied by the person telling it. A few, the more sharp-eyed ones, said very little because they had noticed things over the years that now, in retrospect, told a cleaner story than any of the invented versions. Aldrich said nothing useful to anyone. He had come home that Thursday to find the trunks gone, and Alara gone, and the housekeeper Mrs. Fay in the kitchen, with the particular contained expression of a woman who has decided to leave the explaining to other people. He had stood in the entrance hall for a long time. He had gone to his study and sat at his desk. He had written 3 letters that night and burned all 3. He had drunk more than he should have, and slept badly, and woken on Friday with the gray, gritty feeling of a man who has been overtaken by something he had assumed he had managed. He sent a letter to the townhouse on Friday afternoon. It was 5 lines. He asked if she was well and when she intended to return. He kept the tone careful, not conciliatory, not accusatory, simply careful, the tone of a man who has not yet decided which direction to approach from. She received the letter on Saturday morning. She read it once, folded it, set it aside, and did not reply. He sent a second letter the following week. This one was longer. He said he wished to discuss the situation. He said he thought it was important they speak directly. He said he was concerned for her well-being and hoped they might meet at her earliest convenience. She received this letter, folded it, and placed it in the drawer with the first. Meanwhile, the townhouse had begun to find its rhythm. Alara discovered in the first weeks of her new life that independence, while unfamiliar, fit her in the way that a well-made piece of clothing fits. Slightly stiff at first, then gradually correct. Then, after a short time, the only thing that felt natural to wear. She woke at the hour she chose, without the obligation of a household schedule built around someone else. She ate when she was hungry. She read what she wanted, and as long as she wanted. She walked in the mornings, sometimes for an hour, through the quiet northern streets where merchants were opening their shops, and the early light fell clean and cold on the stone pavements. She began a correspondence with a woman she had met 3 years earlier, and never been able to properly know because her schedule had not permitted it. Lady Helena Worth, a widow of considerable intelligence and limited patience for social insincerity, who now sat on a city committee overseeing public education, and who wrote letters in a direct, unperforming style that Alara found instantly comfortable. They had exchanged 4 letters in 3 years. They exchanged 4 more in the first 2 weeks, after Alara's arrival in the capital. Helena invited her for tea on a Thursday afternoon, and they sat for 3 hours in Helena's well-lit sitting room and talked about books and ideas and the particular social pressures that shape the lives of women of their class. And Alara drove home feeling more fed than she had from any social engagement she could remember. She discovered her mother's kitchen garden had been maintained by the management agent's housekeeper, who had continued growing herbs and a few vegetables simply because it seemed a waste to let them die. Alara spent a Saturday afternoon in it with her sleeves rolled up, learning what had grown and what needed attention, and found, to her own slight surprise, that she enjoyed this completely and without qualification. She began to feel the particular pleasure of a life that was consistently honest, where what she chose to do with a morning was actually what she wanted to do with a morning, where the people she spoke to were people she had chosen to speak to, where there was no gap between the surface she maintained and the interior she inhabited. This was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. But court society does not leave a woman alone when it has a question about her, and by the 6th week of her residence in the capital, the questions had reached the stage where not attending any social engagement was itself a statement. She had declined 3 invitations, gently, with brief and gracious notes, pleading a quiet period of personal adjustment. She had attended only small, private occasions, Helena's tea, a dinner with 2 old acquaintances from her girlhood who lived in the capital, and who were genuinely glad to see her, and had the good manners to ask about her well-being once, and then discuss other things. The autumn masquerade at the Chancellor's Manor was a different kind of engagement. She received the invitation 6 weeks after her arrival, and held it in her hands for a long time. The autumn masquerade was the great social gathering of the season's beginning, attended by 200 people at minimum, covered by every gossip sheet, remembered and discussed for the subsequent 2 months. To attend was to make a statement. To not attend was to make a different statement. Either way, she would be spoken about. She had been spoken about regardless since she left the estate. She had no control over what people said. The only thing she could control was how she showed up. She accepted the invitation. She spent 2 days thinking about what to wear, which was longer than she usually spent on this consideration, but was, she felt, justified by the particular weight of the occasion. She did not want to look as if she were trying to impress anyone. She did not want to look as if she had dressed with an awareness of being watched. She wanted to look like herself, specifically, like a version of herself that had been freed from the mild ongoing effort of arranging her appearance around the preferences and image requirements of someone else. She chose deep burgundy silk. It was a color she had always been drawn to, and had never worn in her marriage, because Aldrich had mentioned once, lightly, that he preferred her in cooler tones. She had adjusted accordingly, the way she had adjusted 100 small things over 3 years, each adjustment so minor that she had not noticed them accumulating until she saw the full sum of them from this distance. She wore her dark hair without adornment, simply arranged, clean and close, the way it had looked in her girlhood, before she learned to dress it to a drawing-room standard. She wore her grandmother's pearl earrings, small and unassuming, and she put on no other jewelry. She looked at herself in the glass before she left the house. The woman in the glass was 30 years old, and showed it, which was to say she looked precisely as she was, not young in the way she had been young at 22, when youth itself was the primary quality of her face. But something more interesting now. She had the face of a person who had been through something, and was not pretending that she hadn't. She thought, good. Clara draped her coat around her shoulders, and they went to the carriage. The Chancellor's Manor was lit from every window, and the sound of it reached the street before the carriage had fully stopped. She could hear the particular orchestrated noise of 200 people in formal dress, pretending to be casual. She had moved through this sound many times over the years. It had never felt neutral to her. It always carried a faint charge, the awareness that this was a room full of people who were watching each other and being watched. She had learned to manage this charge over time. Tonight she felt it differently. She was not arriving as an extension of someone else. She was arriving as herself. The charge, therefore, had nowhere to attach to her that she had not decided in advance to let it land. She handed her coat to the attendant at the door and stepped into the first room. She was not wearing a mask. Most people at a masquerade wore small, decorative ones, more ceremonial than concealing. She had considered this and decided against it. She did not want to arrive obscured, even in the polite, nominal way of a masquerade mask. She wanted to be seen clearly, completely, as she was. She was seen. She was not sure, in the first moments, whether the quiet that moved through the nearest cluster of guests was her imagination or real. Then she caught Lady Frances Whitmore's eye across the room, and watched Frances's expression go through 3 distinct stages in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise, recalibration, and then something that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it, and she understood that it was real. People were looking at her, not with the pitying look she had anticipated, not with the particular social expression that a disgraced woman receives, that careful blending of sympathy and distance. They were looking at her the way people look at something they had thought they understood, and are now realizing they had not. She had expected to be pitied. She had prepared herself for that, and decided she would endure it without reacting. She had not prepared herself for this, for the room to look at her as if she were something they had not seen before, something that did not quite fit the story they had assembled in her absence. She moved forward into the room. She kept her pace easy. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, held it lightly, and made her way toward a group of people she knew. A married couple she had always liked. A widowed lord, who had the excellent quality of never talking about anyone who was not present, and Helena Worth, who caught her eye and crossed the room directly toward her, with the warm, unceremoniousness of a person who does not perform friendship. "You look astonishing," Helena said, without any particular inflection, as if she were stating a simple fact. Alara said thank you, and meant it simply. "People are talking," Helena said, equally without inflection, rather more interestingly than they usually do. "I know," Alara said. "Good." Helena offered her arm. "Come, let's give them something worth discussing." They moved together through the room. People stopped their conversations when she passed. Some recovered quickly and greeted her with warmth. Some were slower. They looked at her with the particular wide attention of someone recalibrating a picture they had held for a long time. A few of the women who had known her throughout her marriage came to speak to her with something in their faces she recognized as relief, as if they had been waiting, without knowing it, to see her standing upright, and had not been sure she would be. She was upright. She was more than upright. She greeted everyone warmly. She asked questions she was genuinely interested in hearing the answers to. She remembered the right names and the right recent histories. She stood without leaning toward anyone. She laughed twice, genuinely, at things that were actually amusing. Aldrich was not there. She had expected he might be, and was neither relieved nor disappointed to find he was not. His absence, she noticed, was being processed by the room as its own kind of information. At the end of the evening, waiting for her carriage, she stood in the entrance hall of the Chancellor's Manor and listened to the last of the guests move around her, and she thought about the woman who had walked into this same building 3 years ago on Aldrich's arm, carefully dressed to complement his image, performing a precise version of herself calibrated to a set of requirements she had not even fully known she was following. She thought about that woman without judgment. That woman had been doing the best she knew how to do with the information she had at the time. She had been genuinely in love. She had been full of real hope. There was nothing to be ashamed of in that. But she was done with it. Her carriage came. She got in. Clara had been waiting at the house and had left a lamp burning in the sitting room window. When Alara stepped through the door and saw the warm square of light in the dark room, she felt something she was becoming slowly, steadily more familiar with. It felt like home. Within a week of the masquerade, the invitations changed. Before, in the weeks immediately following her departure from the estate, the invitations she received had the particular, careful quality of social obligation, the polite gestures of people who felt they ought to include her, rather than people who genuinely wanted to. There was a difference in tone between an invitation issued from social duty and one issued from genuine desire for a person's company, and Alara, who had spent 3 years navigating the social landscape of the court, could distinguish between the two with considerable accuracy. After the masquerade, something in the invitations shifted. They came from different people now, from people who had not been on her regular social circuit before, people who existed in what she thought of as the more serious stratum of court society, the men and women who had real responsibilities rather than simply real positions, who valued substance alongside ceremony. They came with different language, too, less the carefully worded courtesy of the obligatory note, and more the direct warmth of someone who had seen a thing and found it interesting and wanted more of it. She accepted the ones that appealed to her and declined the ones that didn't, which was a form of social freedom she had not previously allowed herself. In her marriage, a certain number of engagements were obligations rather than pleasures, events attended for Aldrich's professional connections, dinners with couples she did not particularly enjoy but whose regard was useful to him. She had managed these engagements without complaint, because she had understood them as part of the shared work of a marriage in their social position. She had not realized, until she was free of them, how much of her social energy they had consumed. Now she could direct that energy entirely where she chose. She chose carefully. She was not performing a social strategy. She was simply following her genuine interests, which she was discovering, now that she was actually allowed to follow them without negotiating them around someone else's schedule, were more numerous and more specific than she had known. She liked conversations about ideas. She liked people who said exactly what they meant. She liked small gatherings far more than large ones, for the simple reason that you could actually hear a person think in a small gathering, whereas in a large one, you could only hear yourself trying to be heard. She went to a small supper at the home of Lord Edmund Hale, a widower of 50 who collected maps and had opinions about the reform of the city's water management, and who was, in Alara's estimation, about the most genuinely interesting person she had met in years. He seated her beside a scholar named Arthur Pennock who studied ancient trade routes and who had the gift, rare in academic men of his generation, of explaining difficult things simply, without making the simplicity condescending. She had a conversation that lasted until well past midnight, and drove home with the warm, useful feeling of a person who had been genuinely fed. She went to a committee meeting at Helena Worth's invitation, a planning session for a charitable organization that funded the education of young women from modest families. She had not done charitable committee work before, which was something she now found slightly difficult to explain to herself. She had been capable of it. She had had both the time and the inclination. But in the orbit of her marriage, she had always somehow been arranging someone else's schedule first, and the committee work had perpetually been something she was going to begin next season. She began it now. She was good at it immediately. She had, it turned out, exactly the skills the committee needed and was missing: the ability to manage complex logistics, to read a room, and understand where the genuine energy was versus where people were performing enthusiasm, to take a tangled problem and reduce it to its useful components. The other women on the committee noticed this quickly. By the third meeting, she had become the person others naturally looked to when a question needed a practical answer. She did not seek this. It arrived because she was simply doing the thing in front of her as well as she could. She had always worked this way. In her marriage, that quality had primarily manifested in the management of the household and the social calendar, invisible work that was only noticed when it was not done. Here, it was visible. It had a direct effect on outcomes that mattered. She found the difference when she first registered it, almost startlingly satisfying. At these events, at the committee meetings and the small suppers and the afternoons with Helena, people invariably tried, at some point, to raise the subject of her departure from the estate. They approached it from different angles. Some were direct, the kind of people who ask a bold question and give you the option of answering or not. Some were indirect, circling around the subject in the way of people who want the information but do not want to appear to be seeking it. Some sent up polite, exploratory remarks and waited to see whether she responded to them. She never did. Not with hostility. She was careful about that. She did not make the subject feel forbidden or charged. She simply redirected, smoothly and without effort, to something else. She asked a question. She introduced a related but different topic. She said something warm and genuine, and moved on. If someone pressed, and a few people did press, not from malice but from the genuine social compulsion to understand a thing that doesn't fit, she would look at them with a mild, pleasant expression and say that she was very well, and found her current arrangements entirely to her satisfaction, and that she hoped theirs were equally agreeable, and she would mean it. People found this baffling. They also found it, after a short time, deeply compelling. There was something in a person who did not need to explain themselves that the watching world found irresistible. The desire to perform your suffering, or your justification, or your righteous narrative. She recognized it as the most natural response to what she had been through, and she had felt it too, in the first days at the townhouse. The impulse to call certain people and tell them what had happened. The desire to have her account of it exist in the world where it could do the specific work of establishing who was at fault. She had thought about this impulse carefully. She had examined it, and then she had let it go. Not because she was above anger, or above the desire to be understood, but because she recognized what performing her narrative would cost her. Every version of the story she told would require a listener, and every listener would carry their own interpretation, and by the time it had moved through a dozen conversations it would be unrecognizable to her. She would be the woman in a story others were telling. She would be defined by what had happened to her, and what had happened to her was only a portion of who she was. She was not going to be defined by Aldrich Voss's choices. The court had other ideas, initially. The Aldrich narrative, as best she could piece together from what reached her third and fourth hand, was ambiguous, which was exactly what he would have chosen. He had said nothing direct to anyone. He had allowed the uncertainty to sit in the room, and uncertainty in social situations tends to fill itself in with the most available narrative, which in this case was some version of something Alara had done, or failed to do, that had prompted her departure. Not said directly, just heavily implied by the emptiness of what he did not say. She was told about this, carefully, by Helena. She received it calmly. She was not surprised. She had anticipated exactly this. And she understood, where a younger version of herself might not have, that the only response to a narrative you can't directly counter is to exist so completely and so clearly as yourself that the narrative gradually stops fitting. She was, as it turned out, rather good at existing. She was present in the city. She attended the right things. She was warm and specific, and interested in the people she was with. She never looked diminished, because she was not diminished. She never looked defensive, because she had nothing to defend. She never looked as though she was trying to prove something, because the things she had to prove, that she was capable, that she was whole, that she was, in fact, better placed in her own life than she had been in her marriage, were proving themselves simply by being visible. Lady Frances Whitmore, who had the social acuity of a diplomat and the memory of an archivist, stopped her at a concert one afternoon and said, with the direct appreciation of a woman who had seen a great deal, that Alara was looking remarkably well. "Thank you," Alara said. "You are going to be quite something this season," Frances said. It was less a compliment than an observation, the remark of a woman identifying a fact. Alara thanked her again. She drove home that evening through the early evening streets of the capital, watching the lamps being lit in the windows of the houses they passed, and she thought about the word that Frances had used without using it. Something. Frances had meant it in the social sense. A presence, a force, a person who takes up their appropriate space in the world, with enough assurance that others organize around them. She had not set out to be that. She had simply set out to be honest. To live as herself, without the modification that had been the constant, invisible labor of her marriage. To follow the things that interested her, speak the truths that seemed worth speaking, and decline the things that did not serve her. It turned out that this, just the plain unadorned fact of a person being fully and honestly themselves, was, in the particular atmosphere of a court that ran on performance and calculation, one of the most arresting things a woman could do. She had not planned it, but she was not going to argue with it. There were now, she was aware, certain people at court who watched her specifically, not with the prying attention of the gossip-hungry, but with a more considered attention, the attention of people who were trying to understand what she was doing, and why, and whether they might learn something from watching it. She was aware of these watchers, the way she was aware of the weather, not distracted by it, not performing for it, simply conscious of it. She conducted herself identically, regardless of who was in the room. This was, she found, the only possible way. The moment you began adjusting your behavior for an audience, you were performing again, and she was done with performing. She was, for the first time in as long as she could clearly remember, simply doing. At a dinner 6 weeks after the masquerade, a young woman she did not know well, a countess by marriage, perhaps 25 years old, with the slightly overwhelmed look of someone navigating the court's social architecture for the first time, sat beside her and spoke to her for the first 20 minutes, in the cautious way of someone feeling out whether a person they have heard about is actually as described. After 20 minutes, she relaxed, and then she asked Alara, with the frank curiosity of someone young enough to still ask things directly, how she managed to seem so certain of herself. Alara thought about this for a genuine moment. "I stopped trying to manage how I seemed," she said. The young woman looked at her for a moment, as if she had said something in a different language, and was working out the translation. Then she said, "Is that possible?" "Apparently," Alara said. "It requires practice." She turned back to her food. The young woman was quiet for a moment, then said something about the soup, and they spoke of other things, and the dinner moved forward. But Alara noticed, from the corner of her attention, that the young woman was watching her for the rest of the evening, with the steady, thoughtful look of someone who has been given a piece of information they intend to use. She thought, yes, that is exactly how it begins. The Chancellor's offer arrived on a cold morning in November, delivered by formal messenger to the townhouse door. Alara was in the sitting room when Clara brought it in. She read it once standing, and then she sat down and read it again. Chancellor Leopold Marsch, on behalf of the Imperial Court's advisory structure, wished to invite Lady Alara Voss to join the Ladies' Advisory Council, a body of 12 women, convened 3 times per year, whose purpose was to provide considered perspective on matters of domestic policy, social welfare, and diplomatic protocol. The council was small, and its work was not public. Its influence was nonetheless real. Its recommendations had, over the past decade, shaped several significant decisions in ways that the official record attributed elsewhere. She had not known such a body existed until 3 weeks ago, when Helena had mentioned it in passing and then corrected herself, as if she had said more than she intended, and steered the conversation onward. Alara had filed this away without pressing it. Now it was on her table in the form of a formal invitation. She wrote her reply that afternoon. She accepted, with genuine gladness, and sent it back with the messenger before evening. Then she sat with her acceptance for a while, feeling the particular satisfaction of something that had arrived not because she had sought it, but because it had found her, found the person she actually was, rather than the carefully curated version she had been managing for the past 3 years. She thought about the 2 other invitations she had received in the previous 2 weeks, both of a different nature. Lord Edmund Hale had called at the townhouse on a Tuesday afternoon. He had brought flowers, not an extravagant arrangement, but a small, good one, chosen with attention rather than expense. And he had sat in the sitting room and talked with her for an hour and a half, about 6 completely different things, all of them interesting. And then he had asked, with the directness of a man who understood that indirect approaches were a waste of everyone's time, whether she would be willing to receive his more particular attentions. She had appreciated his directness. She had told him so, genuinely. She had then told him, also genuinely, that she was not in a position to receive those attentions, not because of anything lacking in him, but because she was in a period of her life that required her full attention to be directed elsewhere, and she would consider it a disservice to him to offer anything less than full attention. He had absorbed this with the grace of a man who had lived long enough to understand that a well-delivered no is a form of respect. He had asked if they could continue their friendship regardless. She had said she very much hoped they would. He had taken his coat and left with the easy good nature of a person whose self-worth was not contingent on a particular outcome. She had liked him considerably for that. The second invitation was less direct in its delivery but equally clear in its intent. Prince Regent Casimir, of the Western Territories, had been at 3 events she attended over the preceding fortnight, and at each one he had maneuvered, with what he clearly believed was sufficient subtlety, into positions near her. He was a man of considerable presence, tall, considered in his speech, with the particular quality of authority that came from having held real responsibility for a long time. He was also, she observed, genuinely intelligent, which she found more interesting than his title. The interest, however, was one-directional. She was not drawn to him romantically, and she had learned in the years of her marriage that she had no talent, and even less appetite, for the performance of feelings she did not have. When his intermediary made a discreet inquiry at a court event, she sent back an equally discreet but unmistakably clear response. She was honored by the attention, and wished the prince well, but she was not seeking any romantic connection at this time. She heard, through Helena, that he had taken this with more grace than his position might have required him to. She thought well of him for that. The Chancellor's Council was, she felt, the best of the 3 invitations. It offered her exactly what she most needed and most wanted: work. Genuine, meaningful, consequential work. Work that used the best of what she had: her attention to complexity, her ability to read the human dimensions of institutional decisions, her instinct for the practical, and applied it to something beyond the management of a household. She arrived at the first council meeting in December with the feeling of a person entering a room they were designed for. The council met in a small, well-lit room in a section of the Chancellor's administrative building that most court visitors never saw. There were 12 women around the table, ranging in age from Alara's 30 years to the 72 of a former diplomat named Lady Beatrice Cole, who had the unhurried precision of someone who had been saying important things so long that she no longer felt any need to say them loudly. Helena was there. 3 others Alara knew. 6 she did not. Chancellor Marsh introduced the matters before them, and then left the room. The women gathered, without ceremony, to work. What struck Alara immediately was the quality of the attention in the room. She had been in many meetings and gatherings over the course of her social life, and she had sat through many conversations about important things that were conducted at a significant remove from the actual importance of the things. People performing engagement rather than actually engaging. People listening in order to wait for their turn to speak, rather than listening in order to understand. This room was different. These women were listening. They were thinking out loud in the exploratory, honest way of people who were not particularly worried about being right versus appearing right, and who were, as a result, much more likely to actually be right about useful things. She contributed 3 times in that first meeting, briefly, specifically, connecting 2 points that had been made by others, and extending them into a direction no one had yet gone. The third contribution produced a silence around the table that she recognized, after a moment, as the silence of people absorbing something and finding it solid. Lady Beatrice Cole looked at her across the table after that third contribution. She said nothing. She simply nodded once, the minimal, precise nod of a woman who has assessed a thing and found it to her satisfaction. Alara drove home after the meeting in the early winter dark and felt, moving through her with quiet and genuine force, the sensation of a person who has found the work they were made to do. She had managed things her entire adult life. She had managed a household and a social calendar and a husband's professional image. These had been real skills, applied to real requirements, and she had done them well. But they had been, she understood now, a narrow channel for a capacity that was considerably wider. She had been competent all her life in a space that was too small for the full scope of what she could do. The council gave her the larger space. She moved into it without hesitation. In the weeks between the first council meeting and the second, her social life continued its gradual transformation. The court had settled, for the most part, into its revised understanding of who she was. She was no longer primarily understood as Duke Voss's departed wife, or rather, this remained a part of her identity in the social record, but it was no longer the most interesting or most defining thing. What replaced it was harder to summarize, because it was simply her, a woman of evident intelligence and genuine warmth, entirely without the anxious need for approval that made most people at court either too eager or too defensive. Someone you looked forward to being near, because her attention was real and her company was honest, and you always came away from a conversation with her feeling that you had been actually heard rather than socially processed. She was, without trying to be, becoming someone people came to. Not in the public, performative way of a woman who has decided to be remarkable, simply in the quiet, accumulative way of a person who shows up as themselves, consistently, and lets that be enough. She listened more than she spoke. When she spoke, she meant what she said. She never talked about people who were not in the room. She never used information someone had shared with her in confidence as social currency. She remembered the things people told her. The sister with the difficult situation, the son awaiting a commission decision, the husband navigating a financial difficulty, and she followed up, quietly, with a note or a word, not to be seen doing it, but because she genuinely cared. This was not a strategy. This was simply who she was when she was not busy being who someone else needed her to be. She had been this person all along. Her marriage had not suppressed it entirely, but it had arranged it in service of someone else's life rather than her own. She was arranging it now in service of herself, and the difference was so significant that she sometimes caught herself standing still in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, doing nothing in particular, and feeling something that was, she thought, simply happiness. Not the performed happiness of a woman who is grateful for her position, just the quiet, uncomplicated happiness of a person who is, for the first time in a long time, in the right place. The gossip about her continued, because gossip in court society does not stop simply because it stops being accurate, but its quality changed. The earlier version, the sympathetic, curious, slightly pitying version about the Duke's wife who had disappeared from the estate, gave way to something more interesting and less comfortable for the people doing the gossiping. People who had initially spoken about her from a position of knowing what she was, began to find, in conversation after conversation, that they did not quite know what she was, and that this not knowing was more interesting than any version they had constructed in her absence. She knew about the gossip. She did not seek it out, but it found her, as it always did, in pieces. She was not indifferent to it. She was not the kind of person who could be genuinely indifferent to how she was perceived. But she had made a decision, in the earliest days at the townhouse, that she was going to give her energy to the real things, the work, the friendships, the ideas, the mornings, rather than the management of other people's narratives about her. This decision had been the right one. She returned to it every time she felt the pull of the other direction. She was not the story people were telling about her. She was the person who was actually living her life. And that life, she was discovering, was considerably more interesting than any story about her could possibly be. The third letter from Aldrich arrived in the last week of November. She had received the first in the week after her departure, and had not replied. She had received the second 10 days later, and had not replied to that either. She had placed both in a drawer in her writing room, not because they mattered enough to keep, but because she was not yet in the position of having handled what needed to be handled, and she did not want to destroy anything until she was sure she was done needing it. The third letter was different from the first two. It was longer. It had, she noted, a quality of desperation that the earlier ones had not, though the word desperation did not appear in it, and was covered over by language that strained toward dignity. He said he wished to speak with her directly. He said that whatever she believed had occurred, they owed each other a conversation. He said there were things he needed to explain, and that he did not want their marriage to end over a misunderstanding. She read this last word carefully. Misunderstanding. She thought about what this word was doing in the letter, what work it was trying to accomplish. It was the specific word of a person who had decided that their best available posture was to introduce uncertainty about the known facts. There was nothing to misunderstand. She had read 12 letters. She had absorbed their dates and their contents with absolute clarity. She had not misunderstood anything. She set the letter in the drawer with the others. She wrote, instead, to Mr. Aldgate. She asked him to begin the formal process of legal separation. She gave him the specific authority he needed to proceed. She sent the letter the same afternoon, before she could change her mind, though she found, when she sat down after sending it, that she had no desire to change her mind at all. The decision had been made weeks ago. The letter to Mr. Aldgate was simply the world catching up to what she had already known. She felt, in the week following that letter, a peculiar lightness, as if something she had been carrying at a slight angle, not quite comfortably, had been set down. Not put down in resignation, but set down with intention, placed on solid ground, and left there, cleanly, because it had served its time and was no longer hers to carry. Lord Edmund Hale invited her to a lecture at the city's Philosophical Society in the second week of December. He had framed the invitation simply. He had 2 tickets. His usual companion had taken ill. He thought she would find the subject, the historical development of water systems in ancient cities, more interesting than most people he knew. She accepted this straightforwardly, because it was an entirely straightforward invitation, the offer of an interesting evening between 2 people who respected each other, and nothing more than that. She found the lecture genuinely absorbing. Edmund sat beside her and made occasional quiet remarks that she found precise and often useful. Afterward, they walked to a small restaurant nearby, and had dinner, and talked for 2 hours, and she drove home in the cold night air, feeling the comfortable warmth of a friendship that had no weight in it, no performance, no unspoken agenda. She thought about the friendships she had maintained through her marriage, and found, when she examined them honestly, that most of them had been something other than friendships. They had been social relationships, maintained for mutual benefit, calibrated to the requirements of their shared social world, carefully managed in the way that relationships between people who are each embedded in a formal social structure always are. They had not been unkind. Some had been genuinely warm, but they had not been free, in the way that a friendship is free, the kind of relationship where you can say the true thing and trust it to land well, where you do not calculate the cost of honesty before you open your mouth. Helena Worth was a friendship. Edmund Hale, she thought, was becoming one. Lady Beatrice Cole, whom she had met at the council, and who had an apartment in the same quarter of the city, and who had now invited her to dinner twice, was something she could not quite name yet, but which felt deeply promising. These were, she understood, the relationships that would last, not because of their social utility, but because of what they were made of. She was in this period of expanding warmth and accumulating good work when she received, in the first week of the new year, a visitor she had not expected. Lord Sebastian Crane arrived at the townhouse on a Thursday morning without a prior appointment, which was itself a statement, either of confidence or of poor social judgment, and Sebastian Crane was not a man with poor social judgment. She received him in the sitting room. He was 40 years old, held a minor but real administrative role in the chancellor's office, and was known in court circles as a man whose intelligence was considerable and whose social positioning was calculated with extreme care. He was not warm, exactly, but he was interesting, and he was direct. He sat down and told her, without preamble, that he had a proposal. She looked at him. He said he was aware this was irregular. He said he had given it significant thought before coming. He said he was not unaware of the complications of her current legal status. And then he said that he had, after 2 months of watching her at court events, concluded that she was the most genuinely useful person he had encountered in a decade of court life, and that he thought they would make an extremely effective team. She was quiet for a moment, processing the specific way he had phrased this. He clarified. He was speaking of a professional partnership, not a personal one. He was working on a set of policy recommendations regarding the city's charitable infrastructure that he thought would benefit substantially from the perspective she had been demonstrating in her committee work. He was asking if she would be willing to review his drafts and contribute her thoughts. She found this so entirely unanticipated, this specific kind of unanticipated, that she almost laughed. She did not. She said she would need a day to consider it. She considered it for 4 hours, and then sent him a note saying yes. He arrived the following week with a portfolio of documents so thick it required both hands to carry. They spent an afternoon at her writing table working through the first section, and she understood within the first 20 minutes that he was not flattering her with the invitation. He genuinely needed what she could see, the practical human dimensions of institutional structures that someone who had spent their life inside those structures could not see clearly because they were too close to them. She was outside. She had a different angle. They worked together for 3 months, meeting twice a week, and in that time she learned more about the actual mechanisms of court administration than she had known in 3 years of attending its social functions. And he, she believed, produced better work than he would have produced alone. When the recommendations were submitted to the Chancellor's office in the spring, they carried no attribution. The Council's work never did, but she knew the words. She had written a number of them. Through all of this, the questions about Aldrich continued to arrive, from various directions, in various forms. She continued not answering them. She had refined, by now, her technique for redirecting these moments to a high art. She could move a conversation from a topic she had no intention of discussing to a topic she was genuinely interested in, with such fluidity and warmth that people often did not realize the redirect had happened until they were already 3 minutes into the new subject. A few people, the more perceptive ones, noticed what she was doing. Lady Frances Whitmore said to her, at a concert in February, that Alara was the most gracefully approachable person she had ever known. Alara said she was not sure whether that was a compliment. Frances said she was almost entirely certain it was. There was, in those months, a quality to her life that she had not expected and could not have planned for. She was profoundly content, not happy in the light, momentary sense of a pleasant afternoon, though there were many of those, but content in the deep, settled way of a person who has found the correct relationship between themselves and their days. She worked at things that mattered. She spent her time with people she genuinely liked. She managed her own household, her own accounts, her own schedule, her own direction. She was entirely answerable to herself, and she was discovering that the self she was answerable to was quite a good one, more capable, more interesting, more resilient, and considerably more at ease with the full range of human experience than she had given herself credit for while she was busy managing the requirements of someone else's life. She was, she thought, on a long evening in late January, when she sat by the fire with her book and her tea and the sound of the quiet city street outside her window, exactly where she was supposed to be. She had no idea how she knew this. She simply did. The news of Aldrich's difficulties arrived, as all reliable news eventually did, through Helena. Helena had the gift of being informed about everything without appearing to seek information about anything. She simply moved through the world with her eyes open and a memory that retained detail without distortion, and what reached her through ordinary social circulation was, in Alara's experience, more accurate than anything conveyed through the specific channels of gossip. Helena told her one afternoon in March, over tea, without editorial, that Aldrich had not been seen at his club in 3 weeks, that Lord Geoffrey Vane had quietly mentioned, at a dinner Helena had attended, that he was concerned about Voss's health, that there were, whispered in the most careful way, in the most private corners of the men's social world, questions about the finances of Thornhaven Estate that had not been audible before. Ilara listened to this. She set her cup down. She did not feel satisfaction at what she was hearing, which she thought said something reasonably good about her. She had, in the months since her departure, examined her feelings about Aldrich with a thoroughness she had not initially expected to be capable of, and what she had found was something more complicated than anger, and considerably more sustainable than grief. She felt, when she thought of him clearly, a kind of sad comprehension. She understood what he had done and why, and she understood that what had made it possible for him to do it was not malice, it was a particular kind of smallness. The smallness of a man who had never genuinely taken the time to know his own wife, because he had never needed to. She had been there. She had been capable. She had been, in the social sense, exactly what he required, and he had not looked past the requirements to the actual person behind them. She had made herself too easy to take for granted. She accepted some responsibility for this. Not for his choices, those were his, completely, but for the particular way she had arranged herself around him, making herself smaller, to better fit the shape of the life he was offering. She had done this so naturally, and so thoroughly, that she had not known she was doing it until the doing was done. She was not going to do it again, for anyone. Helena, watching her face during this telling, asked carefully how she felt about what she was hearing. Ilara thought about it genuinely. She said, "I feel sorry for him, and I feel relieved that I am not inside it." Helena nodded, as if this were exactly right. She did not seek out further information about Aldrich's situation. What reached her was what reached her. He had, from several independent accounts over the following weeks, retreated significantly from court social life. His financial situation, which had always appeared robust, but had apparently been, beneath the appearance, more leveraged than was comfortable, was under pressure from several directions, including a property investment that had not performed as expected, and a debt to a business associate that had been poorly managed. None of this was public in the formal sense, but in the court's social world, financial difficulty had a way of making itself known through the texture of things, the cancelled engagements, the reduced hospitality, the particular quality of a man's posture in a room when he knows more people know than he has admitted. She heard, through a separate channel, that Countess Isidora Lenz had not been seen in his company since February, that the Countess had, in fact, accepted an introduction to a widowed baron from the eastern provinces at a dinner in March, and was, by all accounts, conducting herself with the calm assurance of a woman who had neatly relocated her interests. Ilara received this piece of information with a sort of weary amusement. She bore Isidora Lenz no particular feeling, and she had known, from the moment she read those letters, that a woman who wrote with that particular kind of comfortable confidence was not a woman who would stay attached to a sinking ship. She thought about the version of this story in which she had confronted Aldrich that evening, with the letters on the desk. The version in which she had cried, and accused, and demanded, and allowed herself to be pacified. She would, she imagined, still be at Thornhaven. She would still be managing the household, and the social calendar, and the image of a man whose finances were now fraying, and who was increasingly absent from the events that had given his social position its scaffolding. She would be there in the middle of it, trying to hold it together, absorbing the weight of it, because that was what she had always done. She had not been saved from this by luck. She had been saved from it by the cold and quiet clarity of a Tuesday afternoon, and by the decision she had made to trust what she saw, rather than what she wanted to see. She was grateful for her own clear-eyedness in a way she had not previously known how to be. She had sometimes thought of her tendency to see things precisely as they were, rather than as she would have preferred them to be, as a kind of difficult temperament, an unwillingness to comfort herself that made her, at times, harder to soothe than seemed useful. Now she understood it as a gift. The kind of gift you don't appreciate until you see what it has saved you from. Aldrich wrote one more letter in April. It was the most honest of the four, and, as a result, the hardest to read. He did not, this time, use the word misunderstanding. He said he had made choices that had been wrong. He said this plainly, without softening it. He said he had not understood, until she was gone, what she had been to the life he was living. Not just what she managed or organized or made possible, but what she herself had been. He said he was not asking for anything. He said he understood if she chose not to reply. She read the letter twice. She sat with it for a long time. Then she put it in the drawer with the others, and she went to her writing table, and she wrote to Mr. Aldgate asking about the progress of the legal proceedings. She felt no particular cruelty in this. She felt nothing specific in either direction. She felt simply the quiet, clear knowledge that the letter, honest as it was, and it was the most honest thing he had probably written in years, was 4 years too late. The honesty she would have valued enormously, perhaps enough to change the entire direction of what had happened, if it had arrived in the 2nd year of their marriage, instead of after she had already rebuilt her life on different ground. It had not arrived then. It had arrived now, when she was already gone, when the ground beneath her was different, and solid, and entirely hers. She let it go cleanly, not bitterly, simply, finally, and completely. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer. She closed the drawer with the same quiet finality of someone closing a book they have finished and will not need to open again. She did not destroy the letters, she simply let them be where they were, contained, finished, no longer capable of costing her anything. The legal separation was finalized in late spring, on a mild morning that offered nothing dramatic by way of weather. She signed the relevant documents in Mr. Aldgate's office, and he signed what he needed to sign, and the thing was done with the clean, administrative efficiency of a process that had been prepared carefully and progressed without complication. She drove home through the spring streets with Clara beside her and watched the trees that lined the avenue, which were in full leaf now and making that particular soft sound of new leaves in a slight wind that she had always found beautiful. She felt, in that carriage, a lightness that was not the lightness of relief. She had felt the relief months ago, on the morning she left the estate, but something more complete. The lightness of a thing being finished, of a chapter ending not with drama but with accuracy. This is what it was. This is what it is no longer. This is what comes next. What came next was already well underway. She was not walking into a future she had to build from nothing. She was walking into a life she had already been building, steadily and with increasing clarity, for the past 8 months. The formal ending of the marriage was simply the legal world catching up with what had already been true for a long time. She went home. She put on her garden clothes. She spent the afternoon in the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled up and the smell of fresh earth all around her, and she did not think about the morning at all. She thought about the seedlings in the beds, which needed attention, and the quality of the afternoon light, which was exceptional, and the sound of the city going about its business beyond the garden wall. She was completely present. She was completely here. She had not known, standing in Thornhaven's entrance hall with a bundle of letters in her hand, what was going to come of what she had found. She had not known, driving through the autumn fields toward the capital with 2 trunks and Clara dozing across from her, what her life was going to look like. She had not planned it, or designed it, or engineered it. She had simply, at every decision point, asked herself what was true, and what was hers, and what she could do with what she had, and she had moved in that direction. It had brought her here. She thought, here is not a bad place to be. The council's second meeting of the year produced a recommendation that went, in the quiet and attributionless way of all council work, to the Chancellor's Policy Office, and found its way, some weeks later, into a formal proposal regarding the expansion of educational provisions in the city's eastern districts. Ilara had written the central argument. Not alone, it had been discussed across 2 meetings, and revised by 3 other council members, and refined by Beatrice Cole's precise and unhurried pen. But the original shape of the argument, the particular way it framed the question from a practical, rather than a philosophical starting point, had been hers. She had not said this to anyone. She did not need to say it, she knew it, and the knowing was sufficient. She was learning, in this period of her life, a great deal about sufficiency. She had grown up in a world where visibility mattered enormously, where what you were counted for, considerably less than how visibly and well you performed what you were. The court ran on this principle. The social world ran on it. Marriage, she now understood, often ran on it too. The performance of partnership, rather than its substance. The management of appearances, rather than the cultivation of actual truth. She had absorbed this principle so thoroughly that she had not known it was a principle, rather than simply the nature of things. The work she was doing now operated on a different principle. On the council, what mattered was what you actually thought. In her collaboration with Sebastian Crane, what mattered was whether the ideas were sound. In the committee work for the educational charity, what mattered was whether the practical decisions being made would produce real improvement for real people. None of these contexts had much patience for performance. They had patience for substance and for work, and she was discovering, a great deal of both. The educational endowment she established in her mother's name was small by the standards of the wealthy, a modest annual sum directed to a fund that provided for the tutoring and examination preparation of young women from families that could not afford the private instruction most of their wealthier peers considered a given. She established it in consultation with the charitable committee, and with Mr. Aldgate, who handled the legal structure, and with Helena, who knew which existing organizations could most reliably deploy the funds. She named it the Mara Voss Educational Fund, after her mother. She told no one at first, and then told only Helena and Mr. Aldgate, and then gradually the people whose work brought them into contact with it, and eventually it became one of those things that was known within the specific circles that needed to know it, and not particularly broadcast elsewhere. She preferred it this way. She had no desire for the kind of publicity that attached a benefactor's name to a charitable act, in ways that made the charity secondary to the story of the benefactor. The fund helped, in its first year, 14 young women prepare for examinations they would otherwise not have had the preparation to sit. 3 of the 14 performed at a level that opened doors for them that would not otherwise have been open. She heard about this from Helena, who tracked these outcomes with meticulous care, and she sat with the number 3 for a long time when she first heard it. 3 was not a large number. In the context of the full problem, the enormous number of young women whose opportunities were constrained by the simple accident of the family they had been born into, 3 was not even a beginning. But it was real. It had happened. It could not be undone. 3 women were in different places today than they would have been otherwise, and the difference was specific and material rather than symbolic or aspirational. She thought, this is what real work feels like. It feels like 3. She expanded the fund in the second year. She was more comfortable with her finances than she had initially expected to be, partly because she had managed them with the same careful attention she brought to everything, and partly because the income from the commercial tenant in the ground floor portion of the townhouse was more reliable than she had anticipated. She was not wealthy, but she was solvent, and she was careful, and she had needs that were, in the context of her social world, unusually modest, because she had discovered that most of what she had thought she needed in terms of social positioning and material display had actually been in service of someone else's image, rather than her own genuine requirements. She needed good books, and good food, and good conversation, and work that mattered. These were not expensive things, in the grand scheme of a life. The salon, though she never called it that herself, began by accident, in the way that things you do not organize but simply allow tend to begin. She had started having people over on Wednesday evenings, 4 or 5 at a time, for supper and conversation. Helena, Edmund Hale, who was now a clear and reliable friend, Arthur Pennock the scholar, who had a gift for bringing abstract ideas into contact with practical reality, in ways that made both more interesting. Sebastian Crane, who was better company outside a professional context than inside one, a young cartographer named Philip Drake, who Helena had introduced to her at a lecture, and who turned out to have the kind of mind that connected things across enormous distances, finding patterns in apparently unrelated phenomena with an ease that Ilara found deeply invigorating. A woman named Rose Alderton, a physician's widow who had spent 20 years assisting her husband and had, after his death, simply continued doing the work herself because it seemed absurd to stop, and who had things to say about the realities of health provision in the city's poorer streets that none of the other people in the room had previously considered with any seriousness. These evenings were not organized around any particular topic. They moved where they moved, following the current of whoever was most alive to something that particular evening. Sometimes they were intensely serious, following a thread of thought into a corner, where it revealed something no one had said aloud before. Sometimes they were entirely light, full of bad puns and long stories, and the kind of laughter that happens when 6 people who like each other genuinely find the same thing funny. She looked forward to them, every week, with the particular quality of anticipation that attaches to things that consistently exceed what you hope for them. She was the host, but she did not perform hostess. She did not arrange the conversation, or steer it, or manage the group dynamic. She simply made the food and opened the door and sat down at the table and let the evening become whatever it was going to become. Word spread, quietly, about these Wednesday evenings. She was approached, over the course of that year, by 6 people, asking if they might attend. She said yes to 4 and no to 2, not capriciously, but because the 2 who asked were people she recognized as being interested primarily in the social currency of attending, rather than the actual substance of an evening, and she had no interest in what they would do to the quality of the thing. She was not building a scene, or a reputation, or a destination. She was building a table, where genuine thinking happened, and she was going to protect its quality, the way she would protect anything she had built with care. The 4 new people integrated easily, and made the evenings better. This was the correct test. In the spring of the 2nd year, a young woman appeared at the door of the townhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, with a letter of introduction from Helena, and the quietly determined look of someone who had traveled some distance, and was not going to be easily discouraged. Her name was Harriet Bowen. She was 23 years old, and had spent the past 4 years working, without pay, as an unofficial assistant to a scholar at the city's university, because she was not permitted to enroll as a student, and it was the closest she could get to the work she actually wanted to do. She was brilliant. This was clear within 5 minutes of Alara sitting down with her. Not brilliant in the polished, presentable way of people who have been educated toward a performance of intelligence, but brilliant in the raw, slightly ungovernable way of someone who has taught themselves to think by thinking, in the margins and the early mornings, without a framework or a guide. Alara invited her to Wednesday dinner, and introduced her to Arthur Pennock, and watched what happened when 2 people who are both genuinely excited about the same order of questions find themselves in a room together. She arranged, through a connection on the charitable committee, for Harriet to receive a formal tutoring position that came with a modest stipend and library access. She did this without making it feel like charity. She framed it as what it was, an opportunity that existed, and for which Harriet was the best suited person. Harriet took the position and, 2 years later, submitted the first formal piece of original scholarship by a woman to the university's review journal. It was rejected the first time. She resubmitted with revisions. It was accepted the second time. Alara received the letter, telling her this, on a morning in early spring, and read it at the kitchen table with her tea, and felt, spreading through her, a satisfaction so complete and so quiet that it was almost indistinguishable from peace. She had not done this. Harriet had done it. But she had made a particular morning possible, and that morning had led to another morning, and those mornings had accumulated into this outcome. This was how real things worked, not in grand gestures but in the provision of a specific opportunity, at the specific moment when someone was ready to use it. She thought about her father making her listen to documents at a kitchen table the night before her marriage. She thought about all the things that had been given to her quietly, by people who understood that the right provision at the right moment is more useful than any amount of visible generosity. She had been that provision for Harriet in the way her father had been it for her. The chain of it was beautiful, she thought. The quiet, invisible, specific chain of one person seeing another clearly and doing the small, precise thing. She wrote back to Harriet with the warmth of genuine pride and the brevity of someone who understood that this moment belonged to Harriet alone. Her life, by the end of that 2nd year, had a fullness to it that she could not have designed if she had tried. It had arrived not by plan, but by consistent presence, by showing up as herself, every day, to the things in front of her, and doing them well. The council, the fund, the collaboration with Sebastian, and the ongoing, evolving conversations with Helena and Edmund and Arthur, and the others who had gathered at her table. The garden, which was producing more than she could eat, and which she had begun sharing with the family 2 doors down, who had several children, and an enthusiastic appreciation for fresh vegetables. These were not heroic things. They did not require a stage or an audience. They were the daily texture of a life lived in honest alignment with its own actual values, and their collective weight was, she found, immense. She was 31 years old, and she was exactly who she had always been capable of being, living exactly the life she had always been capable of living. She had simply needed, first, to leave the life that was not quite hers, and to walk, quietly, in the early morning, with 2 trunks and her grandmother's earrings, and a lady's maid who said yes without hesitation, toward the one that was. The winter gala at the Whitmore estate was the last great gathering of the year, and it was the kind of evening that confirmed itself as significant while it was still happening. Alara arrived late, which was not her usual habit, but she had stayed past her planned departure time at a council discussion that had taken a direction no one had anticipated, and which she had not wanted to leave. She arrived at the Whitmore's lit and crowded main floor, with the slightly disheveled inner quality of someone whose mind is still in the previous room, and she stood for a moment in the entrance, letting the noise of the gathering settle around her, before she moved forward. She was 31 years old, and she had not been to this particular gathering in 2 years. The last time she had stood in this entrance hall, she had been on Aldrich's arm, and she had been wearing blue, which had been his preference, and she had had the particular quality of awareness that she always carried to court events in her marriage, the awareness of being watched in a specific way, as part of a specific image, as the visible social expression of a duke's household. She had been good at this. She acknowledged without either pride or bitterness, very good at this. She was here now, in deep green, which was her own preference, and had always been, and she was carrying only herself. She was aware, from the first moments after entering the room, that she was being noticed in the particular way she had become familiar with over the past year and a half. Not the wide-eyed, pitying noticing of the first months after her departure, when she had been primarily a subject of concern or curiosity. Not even the fascinated noticing of the autumn masquerade, when she had still been something of a revelation. This noticing was quieter and more settled. It was the noticing of a room that has incorporated a person into its picture of itself, and found the person to be reliably what they appeared to be. She had, it seemed, become herself in public in the same degree she had become herself in private. This was either a coincidence or a consequence. She suspected the latter. Helena was the first person she found, which was as it should be. They embraced in the warm, unceremonious way of 2 people who have had a great deal of real conversation over a shared period of time, and have therefore moved well past the requirements of social ceremony. Helena asked about the council meeting, and Alara gave her a condensed account of where the discussion had gone, and they were briefly, but genuinely absorbed in this before the social occasion recalled them. She moved through the room the way she had learned to move through rooms, not quickly, not slowly, not with any particular awareness of herself as a moving object in other people's sightlines, but simply forward, toward whoever she was genuinely glad to see, and whatever conversation she was genuinely interested in having. Edmund Hale was near the far window. She had a brief and satisfying exchange with him about something unrelated to the social occasion entirely. Sebastian Crane was in conversation with a group of administrative men she recognized, and he caught her eye across the room with the brief, precise nod of a colleague who was absorbed in their current conversation, but glad of her presence. Lady Frances Whitmore appeared at her elbow at some point during the second hour, with the imperceptible efficiency of movement that was Frances's particular skill. "You are being observed," Frances said, by way of greeting. "I usually am," Alara said. More particularly this evening. Frances accepted a glass from a passing tray and looked out across the room with the unhurried assessment of a woman who has been reading social situations for 30 years and can do it now, the way other people breathe. "You have become something rather specific in this city," she said. "I am not sure there is a precise word for what." "Does it need one?" Alara asked. Frances considered this. Probably not, she decided. She was in conversation with a group of women she genuinely liked, the kind of group that forms naturally when people who have more in common than their social position allow them to find each other at the right gathering. When she noticed a young woman standing at the edge of the group with the polite, slightly effortful look of someone who is listening to a conversation they are not quite part of. She turned toward her and said something welcoming. The young woman moved forward with the gratitude of someone who had been hoping to be included and had not been certain they would be. Her name was Catherine Drury. She was 25, recently married to a count, and had arrived in the capital's social world in the autumn, with the wide-eyed navigation of someone who had grown up in a provincial household and was now in the middle of something considerably larger and more complicated than anything she had previously managed. She was intelligent, Alara could see this immediately, but the intelligence was currently occupied mostly with the effort of making no visible mistakes in an environment where visible mistakes cost more than she could afford to let them cost. Alara recognized the occupation. She had been that woman once. She drew Catherine into the conversation with the quiet skill of someone who does this not as a performance of social grace, but as a genuine expression of the belief that one more person thinking clearly is always better than one fewer. Catherine found her footing after a few minutes and made, eventually, a remark that was good enough that the woman across from her said so directly, and Catherine looked genuinely surprised by the direct acknowledgement, as if she had not yet fully internalized her own ability to be worth listening to. Alara watched this with the particular warmth of recognition. Later in the evening, they found themselves temporarily apart from the main gatherings, waiting for their respective companions to reappear from wherever they had gone. Catherine had been watching her, she thought, for some part of the evening. She could tell by the way the young woman looked at her, the considered, almost academic attention of someone trying to work something out. Catherine said, "I hope you do not mind my asking." Alara said she did not. "I have heard a great deal about you," Catherine said. She was direct, for all her uncertainty about the social world, which Alara appreciated, from several different people, none of whom told me the same story. But everyone who described you seemed to arrive at the same conclusion. Which was? Alara asked. Catherine considered how to put it. That you were the woman who left a duke without saying a word, and became someone more interesting than the wife of a duke. And I have been watching you this evening, and I can see that the second part is true. I can see that you are someone. I just wondered how that happens. The room was doing what rooms do, moving and murmuring and being entirely absorbed in itself. And in the small quiet pocket where they stood, Alara looked at Catherine Drury's young, earnest, intelligent face, and thought about the question being asked. Not the social surface of it, not the, how did you manage the court, not the what did you do when people talked about you, but the actual question beneath it, the real question, which was, how does a person become themselves when the world is continuously offering them the option of being something smaller and more manageable instead? She thought about a Tuesday afternoon and a bundle of letters and a very still and steady pair of hands. She thought about an early morning with 2 trunks and a gray sky and a carriage moving down a long drive. She thought about a kitchen in a townhouse in the northern quarter of the city and a kettle on the stove and the particular quality of a silence that belongs entirely to you. She thought about a garden and a table of 6 and 14 young women who had sat their examinations, and 3 of them who had opened different doors. She thought about what it had actually cost to get from the woman she had been to the woman she was, and found that the cost was not what she would have described as large in the dramatic sense. It was not a single great sacrifice or a moment of blazing courage. It was a series of very small, very quiet decisions, made mostly alone, mostly in the mornings, mostly unremarked by anyone. The decision to read the letters and not pretend she hadn't. The decision to be still instead of explosive. The decision to understand what was hers before she moved. The decision to move. The decision, at every gathering and every drawing room and every moment when someone offered her the option of performing her suffering or performing her justification, to do neither. To simply be present and accurate and genuinely interested in the things in front of her. The decision to let the life she was building be enough, to not wait for it to be recognized or applauded or validated by anyone outside herself before she allowed it to be real. She thought about all of this in the space of a few seconds, which is where the large things live, in the spaces that look small from the outside. Then she said, to Catherine Drury, who was watching her with the particular attention of someone who expects to be told something they will carry with them for a long time, I stopped performing for an audience that was not worth the performance. Catherine was quiet. She was absorbing this. Alara could see her doing it, the specific inward quality of a person who has received a piece of information that is going to take some time to fully understand. "What does that mean, exactly?" Catherine asked, after a moment. "It means I stopped arranging myself to be legible and pleasing to people who were not seeing me clearly to begin with. I stopped making myself smaller, so that certain people would be more comfortable. I stopped spending my energy on the management of how I was perceived, and I spent it instead on the things I actually cared about." She paused. "It sounds simple." It does not sound simple at all, Catherine said. No, Alara agreed. It is not, but it is possible. And once you have done it for long enough, it stops feeling like an effort. It just feels like being alive. Catherine looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into the small bag at her wrist and found a card, the kind used for writing brief notes, and she asked if she might write it down. She said she thought she might want to read it again. Alara said of course. Catherine wrote it. She put the card carefully into her bag. She looked up and said, with the directness of someone young enough to still say things exactly as she felt them, I think you are exactly what people say you are, which is not something that is usually true. Alara laughed. It was the genuine, unguarded laugh, the one she had come back to, slowly, over the past 2 years, the one that was simply hers and not calibrated to any occasion. She said, Thank you, I think. They stood together for a moment more, before the evening drew them in different directions. Helena appeared at Alara's elbow. Catherine was collected by her husband, a pleasant-looking man who was clearly glad to find her. The room absorbed them both, as rooms do, and the evening continued. She stayed until the hour was late, and the gathering had thinned to the kind of small, comfortable remainder that a good evening always produces. The people who were not yet ready to leave, because the conversation was still good, and the fire was still warm, and the night outside was still cold. She sat in a corner of the Whitmore's smaller sitting room, with Helena and Edmund, and a woman she had only met that evening, who turned out to be a historian, with a specialty in land records, and a formidable sense of humor. And they talked until just past midnight, about things she would remember for a long time. She drove home in the black quiet of the city's late hours, Clara half asleep beside her, and she watched the familiar streets of the northern quarter come into view. The pale stone buildings, the lit windows of the houses where people were still awake, the pool of light from the lamp at the corner of her street. Her house was there. Her lamp was burning in the sitting room window, set by Clara before they left, so that there would be warmth to come back to. The kitchen garden was asleep under the cold. Her books were on their shelves. Her notes for the next council meeting were on her writing table. The Wednesday supper was 3 days away. Her life was exactly as she had left it, which was to say it was exactly hers, measured and full and honest, and entirely accountable to no one but the person she had worked, very quietly, over a very long time, to actually become. She stepped out of the carriage and stood for a moment on the pavement before the door, letting the cold air settle around her, listening to the city's late silence. She had not known, standing in an entrance hall with a bundle of letters in her hands, that it would come to this. She had not known what she was beginning. She had only known what she was unwilling to continue, and that unwillingness, followed with patience, and with honesty, and with the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself, had brought her here. Here was a quiet street, and a lit window, and a life that was worth having. She was not the wife of anyone. She was Alara Voss. She unlocked her door and went inside. The weeks in the capital had their own particular rhythm, one that was entirely hers to set and maintain. She woke early, usually before Clara, and dressed in the quiet of her room, with the kind of unhurried ease that comes only to people who have nowhere to be but where they have chosen to be. She made her own morning tea and took it to the sitting room window and sat with it in the early light, which in that north-facing room arrived sideways and late, sliding in at an angle that turned the walls the color of old paper and made the whole room look like something painted with patience. She had begun keeping a journal, not a diary in the formal sense, not a record of what she had done each day, but a working journal, the kind in which you write what you are thinking before you know what you think. She had started it in the 3rd week at the townhouse, on an afternoon when she had too many thoughts moving at once and needed somewhere to put them, and it had become, in the months since, one of the most useful practices of her life. She wrote in it every morning for 20 minutes and set it aside. She did not reread it often. The value was in the writing, not the product. She found, writing in it, that she was a great deal more opinionated than she had previously known. She had always thought of herself as someone with mild, flexible positions, someone who could see multiple sides of a question and found conviction difficult. This, she was beginning to understand, was not an intrinsic quality of her temperament, but a habit she had developed in the years of her marriage, when having firm positions about anything had occasionally required defending them to someone who would rather she didn't, and she had found it easier and more peaceful to hold her opinions more loosely. She had mistaken conflict avoidance for open-mindedness. In the journal, she was as firm as she actually was. She discovered, in those pages, that she had strong convictions about educational access, about the ways the charitable world frequently prioritized its own visibility over the actual needs of the people it claimed to serve, about the particular condescension embedded in certain forms of social assistance that required the recipient to perform their own gratitude, to an uncomfortable degree, before the assistance was offered. These were not mild positions. She took them into her committee work and her council contributions, and found, every time, that the firmness was received better than the managed vagueness she had previously offered. A person who knew what they thought turned out to be considerably more useful to a working group than a person who could see every side. She was also, she discovered in these months, far more interested in history than she had realized. She had studied it as a girl, in the thorough and unenthusiastic way of someone fulfilling an educational requirement, and had not returned to it with any seriousness since. But her collaboration with Sebastian Crane had required her to read extensively about the historical development of the city's charitable infrastructure, and this had led her, through a series of small and incremental connections, into a genuine and deepening interest in how cities had managed the problem of public welfare across different eras. She began attending the Philosophical Society's public lectures. She read the books Arthur Pennock recommended, with the focused attention of someone who has found the right subject at the right moment in their life. Helena observed all of this with the quiet pleasure of a person watching something they expected come to pass. "You are becoming formidable," Helena told her one afternoon, over tea in the kitchen. Ilara looked at her. "I am becoming myself," she said. Helena said, "In certain cases, those are the same thing." She thought about this exchange often. She thought about the version of herself that had existed 3 years ago, the one who had arranged her opinions, and her presence, and her energy around the requirements of another person's life, and she tried to imagine what that woman would think of the one she had become. She thought that woman would be surprised. She thought that woman would also, underneath the surprise, be relieved. There had always been something in her, even in the years of careful management and surface keeping, that had known its own dimensions without being able to fully inhabit them. The relief would have been the recognition of, this is what it was always going to be. I just had to find the way here. She thought this without self-congratulation. The path she had taken was not one she would have chosen if she had been given a choice. She would have chosen a marriage, that was what it appeared to be. She would have chosen the version of her life she had believed she was living, if it had been available. It had not been available. What was available was what had actually happened, and what she had done with it was simply the best available response to an honest and unwelcome piece of information. She did not want credit for having made the best of a difficult situation. She simply wanted to continue making the best of where she was. The city had, by the spring of the second year, absorbed her completely. She was no longer a visitor, navigating its landscape from the outside, the temporary resident of a house she had inherited rather than chosen. She was woven into the particular texture of her quarter, known by the shopkeeper on the corner, on nodding terms with several of the families on her street, an expected presence at the market on Saturday mornings, where she bought vegetables with the cheerful ruthlessness of someone who knew exactly what things ought to cost. The townhouse had become, entirely and without question, home. Not in the way Thornhaven Estate had tried to be home, the home of a managed life, a performed life, a life in which every object was in its place, because its place served a purpose, in someone else's picture. This was the home of a life that had arranged itself. The books on her shelves were there because she wanted to read them, not because they looked well on the shelf. The kitchen garden was planted for what she actually wanted to eat. The sitting room had a comfortable disorder that would have required significant intervention to become presentable for formal visitors, and she had long since decided that she would simply not have visitors who required the room to be different from what it was. She had people she loved in that room. The room was fine.